Injustice in the System, Exonerations by Noelle Relph and Haley Lowers. Exoneration is often defined as officially absolving someone from responsibility, charge, burden, or blame. This term is commonly used in the court system when an individual's charges are dropped or their conviction is overturned. Exonerations themselves can be bittersweet. In the cases we will present today, the exonerations came after the individuals had already served several years for a crime they did not commit. The articles and cases that we're going to be looking at today focus on two individuals, Clemente Aguirre and Relph Arledge. In the case of Clemente Aguirre, he spent 14 years behind bars and was nearly executed before his exoneration. And Relph Arledge spent almost 3 decades serving time for a crime he did not commit. Although two separate incidents, these cases have similarities in how they were improperly handled and resulted in incorrect convictions. They're unjust because the conviction was wrong and the case was handled poorly. The injustice of both these exonerations lies in inadequate defense, improperly handling evidence, and the wrongful convictions of the two individuals. Clemente Aguirre was convicted of a double homicide that occurred on June 17th of 2004. At the time, Aguirre was an undocumented immigrant working at a nearby restaurant, and Aguirre was neighbors with the victims, Carol Boreas and Cheryl Williams. Samantha Williams, whom was Cheryl's daughter and Carol's granddaughter, claimed that on the night of the murders, she had stayed the night with her boyfriend. And then she said the next day she had sent her boyfriend to her home to pick up clothes so she could go to work. And that's when the bodies were discovered and the police were called. The police discovered the bodies of both victims as well as a bloody knife in between the residence of the victims and Aguirre. And later clothes identified as Aguirre's were found covered in blood from the victims. During his interview with law enforcement, he claimed that he first knew nothing about the murders, and then later that same day, he admitted to having gone over to the neighbors looking for beer. Upon discovering the bodies, he says he attempted to revive the victims to no avail, and he picked up a knife for fear that the murderer was still in the home. He later discarded both the knife and his clothes, claiming he didn't call police because he didn't want to be deported. During the trial, Samantha Williams gave testimony that a few weeks prior to the murders, Aguirre had entered the home and stood over her bed while she slept before she woke up and kicked him out. She also immediately identified Aguirre as a possible suspect when she found out about the murders. Aguirre was arrested for evidence tampering within a week, and he was charged with both murders. In 2006, Aguirre was tried and convicted. He was granted a retrial in 2016 and eventually exonerated in November of 2018. The main points of his trial that we're going to be focusing on and come back to later is the testing of evidence or lack thereof. Samantha Williams should have been looked at as a witness and suspect, and Aguirre's actions at the crime scene. As for Relph Arledge, he served 29 years for rape and murder of a 21-year-old woman, Carolyn Armstrong, whose body was found on August 30th of 1981. The victim's body was found stabbed multiple times on a dirt road in a town in Texas. Armstrong's vehicle was also found a few miles away, and the only notable evidence in this case is that there was a black hairnet and half-smoked marijuana cigarette in her vehicle. The case went cold for 2 years, and in 1983, Arledge was charged with the murder. Before being charged with the murder, Arledge and his two acquaintances, Bernie Lamas and Paula Lucas, had been arrested and convicted for an armed robbery. Lamas was the only one who originally told police that Arledge had killed Armstrong, and at the time of the murder, Arledge was in the town where the victim was found. Lamas even claimed that Arledge still had the knife used for the murder, and during Arledge's trial for murder, Lamas claimed that Arledge confessed to him one night before the three were arrested on the unrelated charges, and that he had killed the woman. Lucas, the other acquaintance, also testified, saying that Arledge had threatened her before and admitted to killing a woman. Arledge was convicted for the murder on March 27th of 1984. And in 2006, his case was taken up by lawyers at the Innocence Project, and the lawyers' goal was to locate physical evidence from the crime scene and have DNA tests performed. And in 2011, the DNA testing had failed to link Arledge to the scene of the crime, but the DNA test did match another individual named David Sims. Arledge was officially exonerated on May 3rd of 2013, nearly 3 decades after being charged with the murder. The main facts of Arledge's conviction that we will look at is the lack of evidence tested in the testimonies of Lucas and Lamas in looking at other possible suspects. The injustice in these cases was that there was inadequate defense attorneys. There was no further DNA testing, and officials didn't look at all possible suspects. If they had, the convictions wouldn't have been upheld. Aguirre, as well as being an undocumented immigrant, he also suffered from PTSD, which is a reason that he acted the way he did at the crime scene. And then for Arledge, the whole case was based upon false testimony of his previous friends. He had no connection to the victim. There was no physical evidence, and he had been seen with a knife, which is pretty much what linked him to the crime, and it was completely circumstantial. Inadequate defense attorneys. In the trials of both Arledge and Aguirre, their defense did little to point out the flaws in the prosecution's case. For Aguirre, his lawyer did not demand any further DNA testing, which we'll talk about later, which played a large role in his exoneration. Aguirre's lawyer also did not point out that Samantha Williams should have been investigated as a suspect. She admitted to having severe anger issues. She has threatened to kill her mother before. And in several circumstances, she has actually confessed to killing her mother and grandmother after Aguirre was already convicted. In Aguirre's case, we see and understand why that he was assumed to be the murderer. He did originally lie to the police and admit to being at the scene later on that same day, as well as there was evidence of his clothes being bloodied, and that does seem rather damning. However, his defense lawyer failed to point out that he did have PTSD and that he had witnessed in his home country multiple people being killed and slain, which can explain some of the actions that he took when he stumbled upon the crime scene. As well as his attorney didn't call any experts at all. He didn't examine the evidence. He didn't look into other suspects like Samantha like he should have. And for Arledge, his entire conviction was hinged upon the testimony of Lamas and Lucas. The defense lawyer in this case didn't point out that Lamas and Lucas could have received favorable treatment in their own trials for this testimony. Furthermore, there was no physical evidence that connected Arledge to the scene. The whole case was strictly circumstantial based on the testimony of his acquaintances in the previous armed robbery. Forensic testing and improperly handling the evidence for Aguirre and Arledge, the DNA testing was the key to their exoneration. For the original trials of both, key pieces of physical evidence and biological evidence were not tested. In Aguirre's case, about 150 blood samples were not tested for DNA evidence. And once those blood tests were eventually ran, none of them matched Aguirre, but several of them did match Samantha Williams, who should have been looked at as a suspect. And in the murder of the Arledge case, he was convicted. There was no physical evidence, and the evidence wasn't tested for his original trial. The hairnet that was found in the victim's car, parked miles away, the DNA testing from that, as well as the pubic hair washings of the victim and the marijuana cigarette, matched another convicted felon named David Sims. And Sims had already been convicted before for an attempted murder of a woman in another part of Texas who was also brutally stabbed. Sims also worked at a restaurant where they wore those same types of hairnets, and it was in the same area where the victim was last seen alive. And in both cases, a further look into DNA would have shown and proved the innocence of these two men that were convicted but led to other suspects. Wrongful convictions. The worst part of these cases is the fact that justice was not served. Although in these cases, 3 innocent women lost their lives with the exonerations of Aguirre and Arledge, comes to the realization that whoever did commit the crimes has avoided punishment for their wrongdoings. While the murderers avoided punishment, 2 innocent men did not. Aguirre and Arledge spent years of their life in prison for a crime they did not commit. They too are victims of a crime and the injustice of the system. Relph Arledge was convicted in 1984, exonerated in 2013, which made for a total of 29 years in prison. And Aguirre was arrested in 2004, convicted in 2006, and exonerated in 2018, making for 14 years in prison. He also was nearly executed for this crime. Exonerations can show some of the flaws in the criminal justice system because at the end of the day, justice was not served. Some solutions that we came up with is, first and foremost, we need to eliminate assumptions. Just because an answer in the case, which is a conviction, seems convenient, it's not an excuse for individuals to not do their job properly. It's up to the investigator to identify all possible suspects and explore every avenue as prosecutors fight to present the best case against the defendant. Defense lawyers also must try their hardest to defend their client. Don't rush to judgment. The easiest suspect may not always be the only suspect, and you really need to look at all possibilities for suspects. Next, it's imperative that all suspects be properly assessed. Aguirre was identified as a suspect by Samantha Williams, an individual close to both the victims and whose blood was found at the crime scene. Yet in the original investigation, she was never thoroughly looked into as a suspect for the crime. Even worse, she had claimed to confess to the murders at least 5 times in the years following the conviction. She's still not been charged from the information that we've found. Finally, the DNA testing is extremely important. As DNA testing and technology continues to improve, it plays a vital role in the case because it can lead to the truth when nothing else can. In both cases today, DNA evidence is strictly what exonerated the convicted and led to other possible suspects for the actual murder. Injustice can occur in the criminal justice system very easily. It's our duty to prevent as many unjust actions and convictions as we possibly can. As stated in this presentation, many factors contributed to making the case overall unjust. The injustice of both of these exoneration lies in the inadequate defense, the improperly handling of evidence, and the wrongful convictions of 2 individuals. To help eliminate the possibility of other falsely convicted, we need to ensure that we are looking at all possible suspects. We're allowing for adequate defense of the defendants and thoroughly testing all evidence for DNA and other biological factors. This will help ensure that we are properly doing our job and hopefully eliminate other falsely accused. Injustice in the system.